So welcome to the Insight Meditation community of Charlotte. It's nice to see so many of you there on Zoom tonight. My name is Ward Simmons. I'm one of 5 Dharma leaders that rotate leading on Wednesday night and other offerings. So many of you may be aware that the Sangha, our community's annual silent residential retreat, begins tomorrow and goes through Sunday. And this evening, our topic is going to be the precepts. And that'll be of particular interest to those of you that are going on the retreat, because it's customary that when you begin a retreat, you're invited to take the precepts, and that'll probably happen for those of you on the retreat tomorrow night. But it's relevant for all of us, whether we're going on the retreat or not. The precepts are really fundamental to this practice of insight meditation. And I want to just take a moment and frame the precepts within the context of the broader teachings here. If you've been around insight meditation for a while, you're familiar with the Noble Eightfold Path. And this is a collection of 8 factors that support us in our development. And these 8 path factors are grouped into 3 groups. The first is, one is ethical behavior, one is mind training or meditation, what we have just been doing, and one is insight or wisdom. So the first group, ethical behavior, is understood to be supportive of and necessary for progress in the second group, mind training or meditation, and the factors in the second group are understood to be supportive of and necessary for progress in the third group, which is insight or wisdom. And insight or wisdom really is the culmination of this path. So our progress on this path depends on a strong foundation in the first group of path factors, ethical behavior. And the Buddha offered the 5 precepts as a tool for householders, that is lay people, me and you, to cultivate a foundation of ethical behavior. Now, maybe the most important thing I'm going to say tonight is there are at least 2 benefits from cultivating ethical behavior, 2 benefits from practicing the precepts, probably more. One is that it benefits others. It creates safety so that others can relax and trust that we're not dangerous to them. The other is it brings about change in ourselves. It changes our minds. It changes our way of being in the world. And I just want to read a couple of lines out of a sutta where the Buddha is talking about the precepts. He says, a noble disciple, that's us, gives up the destruction of life. So that's the first precept. That's one of the 5 precepts. And then he goes on and says the same thing about the next 4. Gives up the destruction of life and abstains from it. By abstaining from the destruction of life, the noble disciple gives to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. By giving to immeasurable beings freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression, he himself will enjoy immeasurable freedom from fear, hostility, and oppression. So he's acknowledging both things. It's creating safety for others, and it's also benefiting us. So these 5 precepts are much more than a rigid list of rules that we're expected to follow. Sometimes we can hear them in the context of commandments, but that's not at all the sense in which they were offered by the Buddha. The precepts, they're guidelines, they're aspirations, and they form a framework within which we can conduct our own investigation of ethical behavior. They're often referred to as training precepts or training guidelines. So the good news is we have some latitude in how we implement these precepts in a way that is consistent with our understanding. The bad news is that's really a lot of work. If somebody just gives you a list of things to do and you don't have to think about it, I don't know if it's easy to do it, but it's simple to do it. You know, yes or no. But discerning our own actions and how they relate to these precepts, that takes a lot of effort. So when we enter on this path that we're pursuing with insight meditation, we're really beginning a process. And the default state of the untrained mind is that there's a lot of greed, hatred, and delusion. And this process that we undertake helps us move from this default state of mind to wholesome mind states. That would include generosity, non-greed, loving kindness, non-hatred, and wisdom or non-delusion. So as we progress through this process, this wholesome versus unwholesome distinction can be really useful. It can be kind of a guiding star as we try to sort out how do I behave in alignment with the intention of this particular precept. Stated differently, we can pose the question to ourselves, does this action increase or reduce suffering for ourselves and others? In a way, these precepts serve not so much as answers as they are questions. They're queries that invite us to explore our understanding of ethical behavior. So before we look at the individual precepts, which I want to do next, I want to make two other points. First is our understanding of the precepts and ethical behavior will change over time. So our understanding is not today what it was 5 years ago, and 5 years from now, it will not be what it is today. It evolves. And as our understanding grows, we gain greater clarity around ethical behavior. Andy Olinsky is a Dharma teacher and a scholar, and he says it this way: one's moral integrity tends to be an expression of one's wisdom. When we misbehave, it is out of a lack of understanding. As we gain wisdom and understanding, we behave more in alignment with these values. So the second point I want to make is that we will stumble as we strive to live in alignment with these precepts. It's not realistic to think that won't happen. So the question is not will we fall short, but how will we relate to it when we fall short? So the stumble has already happened. We can't make the earth rotate backwards and change it, but we can look at what's left from that experience and try to put it to some good use. Instead of layering guilt on ourselves, instead of beating ourselves up, we can use it as a training opportunity. We can see our poor choices, and we can use that to inform better choices in the future. So this is an example from my life. When I was in my 30s, I was on a nonprofit board, and I also served as the treasurer, and this nonprofit used a fundraising group, consultant to help out with fundraising. And a grant opportunity came our way, and it came to me, and I dealt with it directly with this party, and they made a grant, and that was delightful. But really, I should have routed that through this consultant. That was their job, and that was kind of our deal. And I saved the organization some money because we didn't have to pay them a fee on this grant. But I felt dirty. I knew after I did it that it wasn't the right thing to do. Even though the organization benefited financially. And here, decades later, I still remember that experience. And while I didn't behave in the way that I would aspire to, it wasn't a wasted experience, because that has served to make me that much more careful and remind me decades later how important it is to be really careful about ethical behavior. So what are these precepts that the Buddha offered us as training guidelines for householders? I'm just going to list them, and then we'll look at each one in turn. Refraining from killing, refraining from stealing, refraining from sexual misconduct, refraining from incorrect speech, and refraining from intoxication. And I mentioned that these guidelines require some discernment on our part to figure out how to apply them in our lives. So it won't come as any surprise to you that the exact phrasing of these, you'll hear different phrasing in different places. The classical Theravadan language is what I'm going to use tonight in my talk, but just to give you a sense of the breadth that's out there, I'm going to look at the first one, refraining from killing, and the language, three different ways that can be stated. The classical statement is, I undertake the precept to refrain from destroying living creatures. There are a couple of, a former nun and a former monk named Tanisara and Kittisara, who founded a Dharmagiri center in South Africa. And the precepts, the version of the precepts they use goes a little farther. It says, to refrain from harming and the taking of life, to maintain respect for life. So where the classic statement is a refrain from, they add to each one an affirmative, a positive aspiration to maintain respect for life. And then the third example I'll offer, this comes from the late Zen monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And in his community, they use not just a statement, but a paragraph on each one. And this is the paragraph, which gives a little more direction. Aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, I vow to cultivate compassion and learn ways to protect the lives of all sentient beings. I am determined not to kill and not to condone any act of killing in the world, in my thinking, and in my way of life. So you can see there are different takes on the precepts, and if you choose to make the precepts a part of your practice and part of your life, I'd encourage you to look around and find the language that works for you. So these 5 precepts, the first one, the classic language is, I undertake the precept to refrain from destroying living creatures. And I understand this to be more than non-killing. It's really non-harming. Killing is just the culmination of harming. So it brings up all kinds of questions. Discernment. Well, what does this mean? living creatures. Does that mean I can't step on a roach? Does that mean I can't swat a mosquito? Can I still go hunting? Can I go fishing? Do I have to be a vegetarian? It brings up all kinds of questions. And happily, the practice of insight meditation generally is not going to try to to command you follow one answer. You're invited to explore that for yourself. So when a mosquito is biting me, the mosquito doesn't have any ill will, any malice toward me. They just need a meal. And so I don't have to let the mosquito bite me. I can brush it off. I can stop it so I won't have a mosquito bite. But I don't need to destroy it because it's trying to get something to eat. And so non-harming, you'll have to explore where that goes for you in terms of, it's pretty clear we're not going to kill humans. If we do, our society's going to respond to that. We're going to go to prison for it, presumably. But when you move away from humans, it gets more complicated. What if you got termites? And now, if you don't do something, your house is going to fall down. Can you get an exterminator? Well, it's killing living beings. And what about vegetarianism? You'll hear different points of view. Honest people, serious practitioners, serious teachers will give you different answers to this. What the Buddha taught his monks and nuns, now he had different teachings for lay people from monks and nuns. But what he taught the monks and nuns was you cannot eat meat if the creature is killed for the purpose of feeding you. So if somebody says, come have a meal, I'm grilling steaks, the correct answer would have been no. But if you're there with your alms bowl and somebody puts chicken in it, then you should accept it and you should eat it. That was his teaching to his monks and nuns. For me, the test I use is, am I creating demand? I am a vegetarian. Am I creating demand? If I learn that my bowl of soup has chicken stock in it, I'm not going to stop eating it because whatever happened to that chicken has already happened. Why waste the food? But if I see on the menu it has chicken stock in it, I'm not going to order it because to do so would create demand for slaughtering animals. So that's just my conclusion. But the important thing is really intention, and that's true for all these precepts. What are the consequences if somebody plunges a sharp knife into somebody else's body? Well, if it's a robber, then it's an unwholesome act. If it's a surgeon trying to save somebody's life, then it's a wholesome act. So we can't just look at the action, we've got to look at the underlying intention. And as we cultivate non-harming, our mind changes. And that's the point I was making earlier. It not only benefits others, it benefits ourselves because our minds change. In his book, 8 Mindful Steps to Happiness, Bhante Gunaratna puts it this way: when we abstain from killing, our respect for life grows, and we begin to act with compassion toward all living beings. So you hear the kind of the unfolding of a pathway there. We begin to change as we practice these precepts. So the second precept, I undertake the precept to refrain from taking that which is not given. I like to add the word not freely given, and I'm not the only person who did that. I got it from somebody else. It's not an uncommon way to understand it, but that really addresses the idea of coercion, just because maybe I can, maybe I'm in a position of power over somebody and they give me something because they feel like they need to. Freely given has a different feel to it, and I think that's more on target. And this precept oddly enjoins us from even picking berries in a field where nobody would ever know the difference. Because remember, it's not just about the other, it's about us and our mind and the condition of our mind. And so our underlying intention would be not to take that which is not freely given. The third precept is I undertake the precept to refrain from sexual misconduct. Now, what does that mean, sexual misconduct? Again, we're called upon to use some discernment here. You know, there was a time when it was understood that it was not sexual misconduct for men to have multiple wives, but it was sexual misconduct for women to have multiple husbands. It was understood that homosexuality was sexual misconduct. In the context of one's time, one has to discern what's appropriate. For me, today, I think if either party is involved in a monogamous relationship, then that is inappropriate, that's sexual misconduct. And if either party is in a position of power, one over the other, I think no matter how hard you try not to let that influence you, I think there's kind of an inescapable element of coercion there, my opinion. The fourth precept is I undertake the precept to refrain from incorrect speech. And in different instances, the Buddha talked about different components of correct speech, but generally it was to avoid false, slanderous, harsh speech and idle chatter. And one of the things we can do as we work with this in our lives, if we take this precept, is we can be careful. People give us invitations to participate in gossip. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or not. They'll make a little comment and then they wait to see how we respond. And if we come on board, then they'll go a little farther, and then we come on board a little farther. You know, it's a little dance we do. And so we have to be careful, and people read our signals. And if we make it clear that we are trying not to behave in that way, people often respect it. Early on in my practice, I had a friend who was particularly inclined to extend this gossip invitation to me, and I found it difficult to resist. And after it was over, I would say, you know, how did this happen again? But it happened multiple times. And I didn't really want to hurt their feeling by saying, you know, some kind of holier than thou, you know, you're doing this wrong. That didn't feel like the right way to approach it. In the end, now this was not a strategy I devised, this was a genuine heart response. In the end, I found that after one of those conversations took place, I would just call them the next day and I would say, I apologize for my speech. That was not right speech. And I did it because that I really felt it. And after 2 or 3 occasions of that, this person stopped extending those invitations to me. So it wasn't a conscious strategy, but it produced the desired result. The last precept, and we're about out of time, is I undertake the precept to refrain from intoxicating drink and drugs which lead to carelessness. To be clear, this does not speak to prescribed medication. Prescribed medication is not a violation of the precept against intoxicants. Now this again is from Bhante Gunaratna. The careful use of pain-killing drugs prescribed by a doctor does not violate the prohibition, nor does occasional light use of alcohol, such as a glass of wine. We must use common sense. Though, he goes on to say, light use of alcohol may be allowed, it is inadvisable. So this is a real hot topic. Some communities, some meditation communities say any amount of alcohol ever is inappropriate. Others say in moderation, common sense. Again, that's a matter of discernment for each of us. Tanissa and Kittisara, their way of phrasing it is, I undertake the precept to refrain from intoxicating drink and drugs which cloud consciousness, the instrument of awakening. So consciousness, the instrument of awakening, we want to apply ourselves to that. Anything that clouds that is obstructing that. And so it's not just giving us an order, it's explaining to us why we might want to make a different choice. So there's a lot more that can be said about the precepts, but I'm going to stop with this and just say, if this is of interest to you, one way people sometimes kind of put a toe in the door is to choose the one that feels like it's most up for you in your life, which one would be most beneficial right now, and focus on that one for 30 days or 3 months or whatever you want. And then once you kind of feel like you've established some mastery around that, then maybe take on a second one. So those are some thoughts about the precepts. If you're going on the retreat, maybe that will give you a little advanced notice. You can be contemplating that. And if you're not going on the retreat, still hope it'll be useful.